Okay, the next text from the ancient world that I want to examine in this class is The History of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. This text was not known necessarily in the Middle Ages. This was not something that survived in the West. It would later be translated from Greek into Latin and into other European languages. But in the Middle Ages, Thucydides as a historian was only known by reputation rather than the actual text. However, there were a number of Roman authors in particular who knew of Thucydides, had read his work, had imitated him. And so his influence is more indirect. The reason I choose Thucydides is simply because he has, I think, the most to say about the themes of this course of really any historical work in the ancient period. His work is, of course, about a war, specifically the Peloponnesian War, which was fought in the late 5th century BCE. This was a war ostensibly between, kind of in simple terms, between Athens and Sparta, or rather between Athens and all of its allies. And you can see from this map that all of the stuff in yellow here, these were Greek cities and towns and islands and so forth that were allied with Athens. And then Sparta and her allies. Sparta's down here. Here's Athens. Here's Sparta. Sparta was allied with other key cities like Corinth and Thebes and Megara. And so you have this is a war between the two. Thucydides himself was an Athenian general early in the war. But as was typical, if a general lost a battle and was held responsible for a military catastrophe, they could be not only removed from their military position, but even exiled from their home city. And that's exactly what happened to Thucydides. He was held responsible for the loss of a territory. Specifically, I believe, if memory serves, Athens lost a battle for the control of this place called Amphipolis. And Thucydides was held responsible. He was exiled, and he spent the rest of his life writing a history of this war, which was still unfolding. And his account only goes to about the year 411, which means that he didn't survive to write the rest of this. He may have lived to the end of the war, but he didn't finish the account. Later authors would offer a continuation of Thucydides. I don't want to delve too much into the context for this war. Suffice it to say that Athens was a democracy, and it was a more open and very commercially vibrant city. But at the same time, it had its own imperial tendencies. It had expanded throughout the Aegean Sea. And this really threatened Sparta, which was far more conservative, far less open to other to kind of contact and influence from outside, but it especially freaked out Corinth, who was the major trading rival of Athens. And Corinth and Sparta were close allies, and these are some of the factors that led to the war. But the war itself, even though this is the backdrop for this text, I really want to look at the way Thucydides deals with the question of war and the effects of war. He also deals with the question of pestilence, because there was a massive outbreak of some kind of disease in Athens early in the war, and so we'll take a look at that. It should be said that this was really the definitive conflict of the ancient world, at least for Greece. This altered the way that Greece functioned as a civilization. Really was kind of the beginning of the end for classical Greece, that it weakened Greece generally. Not that Greece was a unified territory or anything like that. These were all, kind of independent cities who functioned on their own. But this was very disastrous in many ways for Greece. And Thucydides comments on that and kind of holds war as a destructive force. And so I assigned you to read 4 short sections of this, and these are among the more famous parts of the work of Thucydides. It should be noted with Thucydides that there is an effort here to claim authority for writing history, specifically because, Thucydides was an eyewitness to a lot of these events. But at the same time, there's a great deal of invention. History was seen as a genre of literature in the ancient world. This went for both the Greeks and the Romans, rather than as a kind of academic enterprise. There were no universities who had history departments who were trying to write history as it actually happened and be authentic to the past, right? So there are different kind of standards for this. But at the same time, and this is where Thucydides is particularly powerful, right? The study of history, thinking about these historical episodes, offers Thucydides a way into understanding and analyzing and explaining human nature. And so even though he kind of recreates these events in much greater detail than he certainly could have remembered these things, he crafts these long speeches, for instance, by figures like Pericles, which he could not possibly have had a transcription of that or anything. This is all his creation, maybe with some recollection of what actually happened. But in doing so, he comments on the human condition in ways that are just very incisive. I recommend anyone to read Thucydides. I think that it's one of the greatest studies of human nature that's ever been composed. Let's look at some of these examples. So early in the war, Pericles was the kind of the main leader of Athens. Even though it was a democracy, he kind of dominated the democracy, mostly because he was a very powerful public speaker, and that was the number one skill to have in the Athenian democracy. Shortly after the war began, as tends to happen in war, the first casualties were suffered by Athens. In other words, this is like the bodies are coming back and ready to be buried. And these would have been almost certainly young men in the prime of their lives. And so the question arises, of course, was their sacrifice worth it? This is the future we have just sacrificed. Was there a reason for this? And, was this worth it? And should we continue to fight? Pericles was a major proponent of continuing the war. He was the main catalyst for getting Athens into the war in the first place. And so he's obviously going to say, yes, it is worth it. And so, just take a look at a few examples here. He starts by saying that Athens is unlike any other city. We are greater than everybody else, right? And he gives a number of reasons for this. One, our Constitution does not copy, this is the section right here, our Constitution does not copy the laws of neighboring states. We are rather a pattern to others than imitators ourselves. Its administration favors the many instead of the few. That's why it's called a democracy. And the laws that we have are fair to everyone, and so forth and so on. And he even goes on to say that, down in this paragraph, I say that as a city, we are the school of Hellas. Hellas is the Greek word for Greece. And so he says, we are the ones educating everyone else in Greece, all of the other Greeks, on how to run a society, right? And so it's essential for us to continue this war, because if we don't fight for what is good and fair and just, nobody else is going to do this. This may smack of, the kind of rhetoric we tend to see in modern democracies, particularly in the United States, right? This exceptionalism argument. And so when we contemplate the men who have died, okay, they did so for a good cause. He says here, thus choosing to die resisting rather than to live submitting, they fled only from dishonor. Right? Their main concern was not to do anything dishonorable, but met danger face to face, and after one brief moment, while at the summit of their fortune, escaped not from their fear, but from their glory. So died these men as became Athenians. You, their survivors, must determine to have as unfaltering a resolution in the field, though you may pray that it may have a happier issue. Let's hope that not all of us die, but it's worth it. It's necessary for us to continue the fight that these men believed in. The question I would ask if I were, sitting in a classroom with you is, do you buy this? I mean, is this something that convinces you that, throwing away lives in war is worth it if we're fighting for a just cause? This is good sort of political rhetoric. It's pretty common in many historical societies, including our own. Pericles may be a kind of originator of it. But this is a tough pill to swallow if you're talking about, loved ones who have come back dead. So that's something to contemplate. We're going to see this, kind of sentiment rise again in the Middle Ages. A second text deals with an outbreak of disease that happened shortly after the war began. Athens' strategy was to draw most of its broader population. So the city of Athens lay on a plain called Attica, a peninsula actually. And all of the surrounding farmland was part of Athenian territory. It was roughly the size of the state of Rhode Island. And Athens drew in almost its entire population from all of that territory into the city, where they had defensive walls. They did have an outlet to a port, so they could get things in and out via the sea. And Athenian sea power was really key to what everything they did as a society, at least militarily and commercially. And so this is, ostensibly a good strategy, but if you pack that many people, closely together, and you bring the animals and, things like that into the city, inevitably you're going to see an outbreak of disease, right? And actually Pericles himself perished in this plague and left Athens without its main leader. This was catastrophic for this, right? And so one of the things that you might notice here is like the reactions that people had to this outbreak of disease, what it did to their society, how they responded personally to this. Thucydides claims at the beginning of this text that he saw this himself, that he was a witness to all of this, right? And so, what does he say here? This I can the better do, as I had the disease myself and watched this operation in the case of others. So he seems to have caught the disease but survived it. And so take a look. I'm not going to go through any specific details here, but he talks about, for instance, how people, some of them cared for other people but then got sick themselves, and this led to the spread of a great deal of fear, such that some people just abandoned other people, even their loved ones, right? They left to just die for fear that they would catch the plague. And there was a great deal of lawlessness as well, according to Thucydides, that people, down here. Nor was this the only form of lawless extravagance which owed its origin to the plague. Men now coolly ventured on what they had formerly done in a corner, and not just as they pleased, seeing the rapid transitions produced by persons in prosperity suddenly dying, and those who before had nothing succeeding to their property. So rich people die, the poor people sweep in and, claim whatever they can grab in the process. And, whereas robbery had been done, as he says, in a corner, in the dark, now it was done openly. So society is breaking down in the face of a massive outbreak of disease. We might compare this, of course, to our, the COVID pandemic and all of that, and we'll have plenty to say about that when we talk about the Black Death. But keep this in mind, right? This is a good ancient case study for plague and the results that it has, and we can compare that later to what we see during the Black Death. The last two sections here, I think, are the most incisive when it comes to what Thucydides is doing with this work of history. In the first one of these, and this is for some reason not okay, there it goes. He talks about a case early in the war where there's a city named Corcyra. If we go back to that map, okay, Corcyra is right here. You can see the island, and it ultimately allied with Athens. You can see that it's in yellow here. But early in the war, there was a debate within Corcyra over which side they should join. And over the question of whether, which side they should join to fight a war, they ended up fighting a civil war over this. And this case leads Thucydides to comment at some length on the effect that war has on people, right? That, people during normal times, when they're not faced with extremes, would behave much better than when they are backed into, kind of between a rock and a hard place, right? I just mixed metaphors there, but nevertheless, that war, well, let me just quote Thucydides here, okay? He says, for in peacetime, so I'm over here, for in peacetime and amid, let me see if I can highlight this, yeah. In peacetime and amid prosperous circumstances, both cities and individuals possess more noble dispositions. People can talk about, living well and living justly, because they have not fallen into the overpowering constraints imposed by harsher times. But war, which destroys the easy routines of people's daily lives, is a violent schoolmaster and assimilates the dispositions of most people to the prevailing circumstances. What that last clause means is that, war is violent and it tends to make people violent. War is brutal, it tends to make people brutal. Even if they are better during times of peace, right? They give in to these violent tendencies that Thucydides seems to think that we have as human beings. And he goes on, to describe the results of this, and they're difficult even to contemplate, He says, for instance, that behavior that would have been totally unthinkable before the war now became not only accepted, but even preferable, right? He says, just to quote one thing, one who displayed violent anger during this time of war was eternally faithful, whereas any who spoke against such a person was viewed with suspicion. This is interesting, right? Somebody who was violently angry might be seen as a social pariah in normal times, but during war, they become a hero, right? And so war gives place for people who are unsavory and who, society would reject and possibly even imprison or execute for their behavior. Now they become the heroes. Now they become the best people in the society, right? The rules are turned upside down. The worst are ruling and controlling, and the best are held with suspicion because they want to sort of contemplate the best course of action, right? You have to be decisive in war, people say, and often being decisive means to give in to our worst natures. At least that's how Thucydides sees it. I would ask you to simply contemplate. Do you think Thucydides is right? Is what he's saying about human nature, particularly during times of extreme circumstances, is this true? Is this how we are as human beings? Do you think he's right? Or, is there some other way to see this? I'm not going to answer that for you. I honestly, the question's kind of open for me on this. It's one of the reasons I like reading texts like Thucydides. It makes me think about this. The last section here is what's called the Melian dialogue. You will see this in political science courses. This is a sort of classic text for thinking about war, diplomacy, the question of whether war is just. It is, in my opinion, a haunting text. It is one that every time I read it, I just come away shaking my head, like, how can people possibly justify these kinds of opinions? This instance, this is a recreation of something that Thucydides may have had, some personal knowledge of, but a lot of this is just his attempt to capture the circumstances. Right in the middle of the war, around the year 416, Athens went to the island of Melos. Melos is here. Okay, Melos is shown in red, but that's really only because of what happened here. In this case. And they said to Melos had, up to this point, 15 years into the war, remained neutral. Even though they were originally a Spartan colony, they had chosen to remain neutral in the war. They weren't helping either side. They were trading with both sides. They were, not necessarily helping either side, but they just wanted to stay out of it when it came to actually fighting the war. Athens sent some ships to Melos and a large number of troops. And they basically say to the Melians, you need to join us. We're not going to give you a choice. You have to join us. And the Melians say, well, we want to just remain neutral. They say, no, we need your territory. And so you can either join us and fight alongside us, or we're going to kill you. And this leads to a dialogue between the two sides that I'll let you read and kind of puzzle out for yourself. But the gist of it is that the Melians are saying, how can you see this as just? How can this be acceptable behavior? And the Athenians essentially say, we don't care. We're stronger than you, therefore we can make the rules. The phrase "might makes right" comes to mind here, and this may even be the kind of originator of that thought. Not that Thucydides uses exactly those words, right? But if you look at this section, for instance, since you know as well as we do that right as the world goes, and by right they mean what is good and just, right as the world goes is only in question between equals in power, while the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. And so if we are stronger than you, then we are justified in taking what we need. And the Melians are like, well, that's just not right. And the Athenians are saying, basically, well, stop us. Tell us why this is wrong. And they say, well, the gods won't like this. Like, don't make me laugh. The gods take whatever they want. And there are lots of stories, of course, in Greek mythology of gods, if they lust after a human sexual partner, they just take that sexual partner and rape them or force themselves on them, right? The gods... The Athenians are saying we're actually behaving like the gods in doing this. Okay. The result of this was that Athens destroyed Melos. The Melians did not give in, and the Athenians, if you looked at the bottom of the text here, okay, the Athenians invaded Melos, and they, very last line, who put to death all the grown men whom they took and sold the women and children for slaves, and subsequently sent out 500 colonists and inhabited the place themselves. So they brought in Athenians and repopulated the territory. This is genocide, all in the name of democracy, right? Or at least in the name of trying to win the war that they're fighting. So back to the question of human nature, right? Given circumstances, will people behave badly? If circumstances permit and even perhaps call for, at least in the opinion of some, unjust behavior, right? Will people feel justified and will they go that route? The Athenians seem to have certainly gone that route in this case. So a lot to think about here with Thucydides. Hopefully you get something out of this and we can have a good discussion about it on the discussion.